Welcome back to Beyond Four Walls, Conversations on Affordable Housing. I'm David Dworkin, President and CEO of the National Housing Conference, the nation's oldest and broadest affordable housing coalition. I'm joined today by Will Cooper Jr., President and Chief Executive Officer of WNC and Principal of Preservation Equity Fund Advisors, where he directs the overall business strategy for both companies, continuing a legacy of leadership in affordable housing investment and preservation. WNC is known as both a pioneer in the affordable housing space and a leader in tax credit syndication, community preservation services, and private equity fund management. Since 1971, the company has raised more than $20 billion in equity and has created or preserved over 1,725 communities in 49 states. Will is also the co-founder and president of the Cooper Housing Institute, a private foundation that supports innovative research, public awareness initiatives, and community organizations with the goal of ending the housing affordability and homelessness crisis in the United States. Before joining WNC in 1988, he worked in government and legislative affairs at Honda North America in Washington, D.C. A longtime housing advocate, Will is actively engaged at both the federal and state levels, working to advance legislation and policies that support housing affordability, preservation, and development. Welcome, Will. Thanks for joining us.
Thank you, David. Thanks for having me. Very much appreciate it.
So you really are the tip of the shovel in our housing affordability crisis, literally and figuratively. It's all people are talking about, it seems. And I often have said over the years that housing is often in the top 5 of the issues that Congress and the administration are dealing with. What ends up happening is we come in 4 or 5, and instead of being a medal winner, we end up with a participation ribbon. And we've got a big box full of participation ribbons. I do think that this year it could be different. There's both focus by the administration and members of Congress, not just on the policy issues, but on the actual practical issues of people who are saying, hey, I've never worried about this in my life, and now I'm very worried about it. So tell me a little bit about WNC. You guys are a pioneer. You go back to 1968. When I read about the way that the company was formed and how you initially took advantage of the 68 Housing and Community Development Act, I thought it was interesting. I looked up at my desk. I actually have the pen that was used to sign the act by President Johnson. So we have that in common for sure. Tell me a little bit about, I think it was your dad who started the company, who we've honored in the past as a housing visionary. You guys have done a lot. Give us a little background on the company, because I think most people, despite your being in 49 states, don't really know who WNC is.
Yeah, no, I appreciate that intro, David. Thank you very much. And I also want to carry the cliche a little one step forward and have to say that at this point in time, we're about ready to put down our shovels and pick up the spears, because that's what we have to do now to make this transition, to make housing a priority. But very, very well said there. Yeah, so my dad started WNC in 71. And at that time, the housing crisis was kind of just starting to emerge. This was a decade that followed the space exploration under the Kennedy administration. And he came learned a lot about the law and what tax advantages were out there for this type of an investment. And when he brought it back to the board, they heard him out and listened to the pitch. And then they said, thank you very much. You're no longer employed here. So they gave him his pink slip because they didn't want to pursue that project. And he came home to my mom, apparently, and my mom said, let's celebrate. So he learned enough through that process of investigating manufactured housing that affordable housing is a realistic opportunity to create an investment here. So he started WNC actually in 71 after doing a couple of years of just dabbling as a consultant. And since that time, he's been really our inspiration for advocacy. He's been very active over the years, in various associations, Euro Association, NHC, and then, of course, NHB and National Multi-Housing Council and others. So it's been great to work with him, and I really have enjoyed the mentoring that he's done.
All right, this is mind-blowing. It doesn't take us long to wander off topic, but my uncle was Werner von Braun's mathematician. And when your dad started the company, I was probably wandering around his basement pulling up all of this data and reports on getting monkeys into space. So that's wild. I don't know if was he ever in Huntsville?
I don't know if he was based here in LA. They have a big division out here, but I'm
Yeah,
not sure he was in
I
Huntsville, but
love
I'm
it.
sure that he
So
dealt with those folks at some
I'm
point.
sure he did. That's a riot. So, and the other thing I just want to note is that you, like so many of us and me, kind of, or your dad, that is, stumble into housing. And you started outside of housing, and we fall in love with housing. And it makes a permanent turn in our career. I've been doing housing ever since. And it was not my intention when I first started doing it. And then, it just, you never leave because it's so meaningful and tangible, and especially tangible for you all.
Yeah, I didn't start my career in housing. I was back in DC and worked as a government affairs for Honda for just a couple of years and really fell in love with just the whole legislative process, policy creation, et cetera. And then my dad and I talked after we had a bit of a family situation occur and I needed to go back to California. So he said, come on back. We'll get you started back here with the company and see how you like it. So I went back to California. At the time, this is right after the 86 Reform Act. So, he was a couple days away from filing bankruptcy because in those days, they completely changed the tax code. A
Right.
lot of folks went out of business and he was able to hang on, but he had to go back to the house and start from scratch. And he had 3 or 4 people working there. So I got to go back to work with him and reported in my own bedroom. We set up a desk
Yeah.
and a phone there where I grew up in the bedroom there. And it's a little bit of a change of pace, coming from DC on the Hill, walking the halls of Congress to going back to your old house and working from there. But yeah, that
Wow.
was over 35 years ago. So I have to say it's been a good run. And, once I got involved with the housing space, especially the affordable housing industry, of course, those days, it was very early days of the tax credit program, which was just getting off the ground. It was still not a permanent program. So I started calling on financial planner and brokers to raise capital for these investments and quickly learned that it's a great win-win. You're doing well by doing good and you're providing good returns, but
Right.
also creating something that's in, a huge need out there.
So basically, you got to work for a 15-year-old startup.
Basically, yeah.
Yeah.
Start over. We'll call it a start over, a
There you
do-over.
go. So that's the next big, shift is this 86 tax bill. They were already going to kill these programs that they'd been using. And Congress and some of the advocates we still work with today came up with this idea of the low-income housing tax credit. It's been incredibly successful. And I think you guys were doing some of the earliest deals in that.
Yeah, definitely. We got involved. In those days, again, all of the capital that was raised was from individual mom and pop investors. There was no
Hmm.
institutional market. This was a brand new program. And by the way, the program was launched on the heels of the great crisis in the 80s when FIREA and all these things
Yeah.
were created. S&Ls were going bankrupt because the tax code was incentivizing builder developers to build these office buildings, see-through office buildings that were never going to have occupancy just for the tax benefit. So there's a lot of activity in real estate back in the early 80s that just disappeared. And then so the credit was created, and by the way, when they created the credit, they didn't wipe out the incentives for investors in affordable housing in the 86 Acts. They actually grandfathered them in because
Hmm.
Congress, which I remind investors, has always protected investors in affordable housing as opposed to other forms of real estate because of the demand and the need for that, for the housing there. So that was true in 86. And then, we were raising money from mom and pop investors. And then around the early 90s, when Clinton was elected, the program became permanent. And at that time, we started to see a shift from the individual to the institutional investors because now the institutions can start to put resources into it. It's a permanent program. And the industry has really just blossomed ever since then. It's become more efficient, more sophisticated, more effective, et cetera. And, along the way, of course, we've seen increases in the program over the years. But for the most part, it's always maintained a very strong bipartisan support, both Democrats and Republicans. I always like to say that the Democrats really enjoy the program because it provides the needed affordable, for those can't afford it, and the Republicans like it because it's a private-public partnership, right? It has the efficiencies of
Right.
the private sector to make it work, unlike public housing, which is a whole different animal. So, yeah, interesting times.
we are never afraid to nerd out on housing policy and housing technical aspects here. Listeners will love that. But I also always want to be sure that we're giving people the context they need. So if you're not familiar with LIHTC, give us a brief perspective on how it works and why it matters and has been so effective.
Yeah, good question. LIHTC stands for the Low Income Housing Tax Credit. And what it is it's basically a tax credit, tax incentive is distributed by the U.S. Treasury to the states across the country. And the states, in turn, decide which kinds of properties, affordable properties, they want to allocate credits to, whether it's a seniors project or a preservation project or families. Whatever the need is at that particular state, they decide where the priorities are. The credit's then allocated to developers that apply for this. It's very competitive. And then developers receive an allocation. And then when those credits are allocated to a certain project with a certain developer, the developer in turn reaches out to investors to basically sell the credits as an incentive to invest equity to the properties, to build the properties. There's lots of oversight. It's a well-established program. There's a long-term commitment to these properties remaining affordable. Most states are at least 30 years dedicated when these properties are built to remain affordable, but in a lot of states, it's actually 50 years as well. So it's been a very effective program and very well established with particularly the banking and insurance communities as an investment option.
So I want to get into some of the programs and projects you've been involved in, like Cooper Institute and this new study. But let's take a step back first and talk about housing supply and production, because it's such a big crisis right now and it's complicated. It drives me crazy when people are like, oh, well, all you have to do is this and all you have to do is that. And I'm like, no, that's just not how this works. And there's a lot of moving parts, and some of them are working well and some of them are stopping the other ones from actually working well. So tell me about the supply challenges that you're seeing on the rental side. How is that different than what single-family folks are doing? And how did we get so far behind?
Yeah, another good question. I like to say that what we're realizing is we really don't have a housing crisis in this country. What we've got is a housing policy crisis. And when I say that, what I'm getting at here, and this goes to why we established the Cooper Housing Institute, is that we've spent the last 3 decades or more passing laws at the local, the state, and the federal level that effectively have made it very difficult, if not impossible, to build homes. And, we can go through the list of legislation at every level, but the reality is we spent a lot of time protecting our environment for a good reason, right? We weren't so good at protecting our environment as a country back in the first part of last century. We created lots of damages to our rivers, our lakes, our oceans, our air, et cetera. So the last, 30 years or more, we've been passing laws to correct that, which makes sense. But the problem with that is the unintended consequences. It's become very difficult to build at the local level, which is where it all starts. And we need to look at that. We need to look at how we can change that and create not just incentives, right, to build housing, but just a level playing field. So we don't have to go through 5 years of regulatory burdens just to put a shovel in the ground. So that's kind of the message that we're trying to get to. And I think we're starting to see at every level a realization that we've kind of gone too far when it comes to the regulatory requirements to do anything to build homes. This goes to how do we establish a better balance between protecting the environment, but also protecting someone's right to live in a home, whether it's a rental home or a home ownership.
And who's paying for this environmental protection? Because what it ends up being is people who can afford it at the very least, because they can't afford to buy a house or rent an apartment where the price has been really increased dramatically as a result. I think the most important thing that I've learned is that it's not the regulations per se, it's the 5 years of delay. And these regulations are often used far outside of their intended purpose for the design of stretching that out, recognizing that the time value of money will eventually discourage people, and what you'll end up with is nothing because they don't want anything there in the first place.
You have to remember that to build a home or an apartment building or a housing development takes a certain amount of risk, right? You have to find the land, you've got to find the money to do it, and then you've got to put your own money at risk. And if it takes 4, 5, or 6 years to do that with no assurance that you're going to actually be able to get to the finish line, why would you do it? And that's, I think, what's happened is a lot of
Yeah.
builders that have been able to do quite well decades ago have simply moved on because the risk is just not worth the reward. And people blame oftentimes the developers as being greedy and seeking this high profits and this and that. But we're a capitalist society. We have economics in every industry that is there for a reason to incentivize the private sector to do what they do well. Housing's no different. So if we take away the profit motive and put up all these barriers that prevent anyone from wanting to take risks, you're going to end up where we are now, which is not enough housing being built and the government having, frankly, to over subsidize, whether it's through Section 8, which is a great program, or whatever else to subsidize the construction. You have a problem. And I think that the big focus now is, which we're seeing now at the local level as much as at the federal level, is regulations have to be revised. We have to soften these regulations, these delays, these barriers to incentivize or at least give an opportunity for builders to do what they do.
So there are two major laws that impact this. Nationally, it's called NEPA. And in the state of California, it's called CEQA. And one of my favorite ironies in this is, Ronald Reagan is famous for saying the 10 scariest words are, I'm from the government and I'm here to help. And yet it's also true that the person who signed CEQA into law was President Reagan, and when he was governor. And if you flip forward, just like that is kind of hard to get your head around, the guy who helped peel it back in California is Governor Newsom, former mayor of San Francisco. So, that's just one of the many unique ironies that we run into housing all the time. So how has that worked with the changes in CEQA, and what are you seeing on the ground? It's pretty recent.
Yeah, so that's a really interesting point you make. Reagan signed CEQA into law and actually, effectively promoted that when he was running for president as a real big step forward. And not only did Newsom has tried to roll it back, but even Jerry Brown has tried to roll it back to no effect. But CEQA is a very telling example of where things have gone wrong. So they passed CEQA, which really isn't a restriction of building homes or construction in general. What it is, it's a requirement it creates a process that requires any developer to submit an environmental impact report, which then becomes public and then opens the door for anyone to come in and resist or oppose that project. And so what's happened is, and that wasn't the original intent of the law. It actually took a couple of court cases to put the law into where it's at now, where any shovel in the ground is creating a requirement for this submittal. So effectively, any project that is to build housing, you now are immediately facing not only the burden of going through that process, but now you've got local opposition coming forward. You've got other folks that oppose any development, including the environmental groups, as well as the labor unions, et cetera, which are seeking other things like project labor agreements, et cetera. But to give you an example, not to go into too much detail here, but when the CEQA was passed in 1970, actually go back even earlier. I was born in 63, not to date myself, which I shouldn't do publicly, but there I go. The population in California was 17 million, give or take. Fast forward to 2020, 57 years later, population is almost 40 million. So we've increased the population by 230%, give or take. In 63, when we had a population of 17 million, we were actually producing about 200,000 housing units a year. Okay, and then you fast forward to 2020, we're producing less than half of that. We're actually at 100,000, in some cases less than that annually of production, when in the meantime, while our population has exploded. So you wonder why we have this problem. Now, if you graph this out, you can easily see that the production continued to grow up to about 250,000 in the very early 80s, late 70s. And when CEQA was passed, it took several years for it to really take effect. And as a result of that act, and as a result of other acts, including the Coastal Act, you could just see a continual decline of production after that. So obviously, the data is there for everybody to see and read, but there are people that resist change, and the fact is that there are people in California, strong advocacy groups that don't want to see any new construction. They want to see people leave the state. We don't want to damage the environment. And there are other folks that want to just make sure that they get paid a prevailing wage that increases costs as well. And they'll use CEQA to make sure that happens. So a lot of competing interests. But at the end of the day, I think we're seeing the needle start to move. The legislature in California has become much more aware, and we're starting to see bills being passed that are softening the impact of CEQA, for example.
Yeah. It's been an interesting evolution, and I know a lot of people, particularly in the housing world, are familiar with Ezra Klein and Derek Thompson's book, Abundance. One of the points they make is that this is an issue of having too many competing goals and trying to put them all together in the same thing. One of the things they say is that one of the reasons Los Angeles is failing is that you have regulations involving air filtration systems for developments near freeways when you've got people literally living under the overpasses on those freeways. And that's a pretty big disconnect.
Yeah, there's so many different policies that have been put forward through whether it's LA or San Francisco or even the smaller communities as well. I mean, you've got local zoning requirements that, are direct barriers to building multifamily housing. 70% of the land in the United States that's zoned for residential is zoned for single family only. And in order to change that, you've got to go through long time, lengthy zoning variances that may never happen. So there's that challenge, and then to build multifamily, you have restrictions on height limits. You've got opposition, neighborhood opposition to development in general. I think multifamily has a certain stigma, if you will, where people feel like it's going to change the character of the community. It's going to create traffic problems and parking, et cetera, et cetera. But we do need more density at the end of the day to be able to catch up with the demand, and California is leading the way there.
Yeah, and sometimes it changes the character of the community for the better.
That's right.
Creates more healthy small business markets and shorter commutes. People often don't look past their own property line. I often say, if you don't want affordable housing in your backyard, you're going to end up with homeless people in your front yard.
That's my favorite quote that you've done over the years. I appreciate that.
I'll stop saying it when it's no longer true, but we talk about these regulations, and there are regulations that are used by NIMBYs to prevent development, but there are also regulations that are designed to help create affordable housing that often underperform. And I think that home program and Section 8 Housing Choice Voucher program are two examples of what I believe are really good programs that could be doing a lot more. And it's entirely avoidable if we're willing to address it. And so you've been involved, the Cooper Housing Institute, Rand Corporation, and the Terner Center in some really important work on this. And I want us to get kind of in the weeds on this and learn more, because it's so important. Even if we don't increase the amount we're investing in the Section 8 Housing Choice Voucher program, and I do think we should, we could be helping more people with the same amount of money. And I do believe we should be doing both. But tell me about this study. How'd you get into it? And what have you learned? Because the ink is still wet on this one.
Yeah, no, thank you for that. And we did choose this study and choose to work with the Rand Corporation and the Housing Center at Berkeley, the Terner Center. We picked those two organizations for many reasons, but interestingly enough, my father had a relationship with the Rand principals back in the early years of his company because they had invested in some affordable housing stuff way back before the tax credits. But we also always knew them as to be like, the gold standard for research, having been a research organization since the World War II. But Terner being so advanced on the housing side, we thought they'd make a good combination. So we chose those two to do a study on how can we improve the efficiency of the Housing Choice Voucher program, recognizing several things. One, that the program's been around a long time. It's a very successful program. It's been around over 50 years. It houses 2.3 million households or 5 million people. Most of those folks are 30% or less of AMI, so they're living paycheck to paycheck. And then half of those folks are families with dependent children, with the balance being seniors or disabled. 45 to 50% of the residents that have vouchers are disabled. So these people don't have many choices, right, when it comes to housing. So we felt that the program, given its success, we also realized that there were some inefficiencies. And it kind of became obvious during COVID that there was emergency vouchers being issued, and a lot of the local agencies weren't able to fully allocate their emergency vouchers, and it kind of triggered our feeling like, okay, well, if they can't do those, are they fully allocating their other traditional vouchers that they would get, on an annual basis? And we found out that they had not been able to. Generally, there's many of the organizations are very effective at allocating their vouchers, like 95 or 100% of them, but there are some out there, like 30% of the agencies, that don't fully utilize their vouchers. So we thought, well, rather than try to just go to Congress and seek to increase the program, which a lot of folks are advocating for, which we support, why don't we try to make sure it's at its greatest efficiency before we do that? And that was the purpose of the study: is how do we move from 70% utilization in certain jurisdictions to 95 or 100% utilization of the vouchers. And that's the purpose of the program. The Rand Corp and Terner Center interviewed hundreds of stakeholders, users of the program, management companies, private sector, public sector, housing agencies, HUD, et cetera, and found out that there are several things that could be done, that are being done by very successful agencies to fully allocate their vouchers. So the study has several recommendations that can be used right now. In other words, could be done immediately, and others that might take a little more time, but they can be done without legislation. These are things that we wanted to make sure we could do, or that the agencies could do, without having to go to Congress and have them pass a new law to make these things possible, because that may take 10 years or may never happen. So that was the purpose of that study.
So tell me about some of the regulatory changes that would make the program better. What are some of the things that are frustrating to you as a developer?
Well, first of all, there is a burden when you take on a voucher holder. As an owner, developer, manager, you have to go through steps to accept that voucher holder. That can take time. It may take 2 months. It may take 4 months or 5 months, okay? And some landlords may look at that and say, I don't have that time, especially when I've got somebody at my door right now ready to write a check from rent that can afford it. Why would I take the voucher holder? So there's that challenge, right?
And the cost of the empty unit.
And the cost of the empty unit, exactly. So that's probably the biggest challenge that we face, and there are ways to address that we're looking at as well. The other challenge has been that the rental markets have been very tight, as you can imagine, with COVID and everything else. Rents have been rising faster than they've risen in a long time. And the fair market rents that the voucher program will pay often doesn't keep up with those market rents. So we have to figure out a way. A lot of the more sophisticated agencies have figured out a way to be more creative, to meet those higher rents that are out in the market, to make their vouchers more competitive. So there's that. And then there's also a bit of a, change that's probably needed longer term with the housing agencies and HUD itself in terms of how they view the private sector. I think that there needs to be a transition from these are folks that are going to take advantage of us to these are our customers. The landlords, the private property owners that are accepting vouchers need to be treated as a customer. You need to be proactive in working with them and communicating with them and recruiting them and doing the things that any private business would do with their customers to be able to get those vouchers put to work more efficiently.
So what do we do now? You've got the report. You are not the first report.
There's several recommendations. I'll start with probably the simplest one that can be done right away, and that is extend the search times that are allowed for the voucher holders. Right now, when you accept a voucher, you have basically 60 days to go find a unit. That's not set in stone. So I think that sometimes it takes voucher holders, especially in these tighter markets, 60, 90, 180 days, possibly longer, to find a unit because of the competitiveness out there. So
what happens if you don't?
Well, you lose your voucher. That's the problem. And it goes back to the till and we start over again. So
What's the point of that? Why is that even in there?
regulatory disconnect, it's
Yeah.
something that can be changed. But the agencies, the public housing agencies have the ability to extend that
Mm-hmm.
to automatically. So that's
Okay.
something that the report talks about in detail. So that's something we would recommend that they look at. The other thing we talked about just now is the customer service, taking on more of a customer service
Mm-hmm.
approach. It's important to be proactive in recruiting landlords and private property owners so that you're not just leaving it to the voucher holder to go out and go it alone on the by themselves. They may not have the resources, they may not have the sophistication to do that. The agencies can help them with that. They can hire housing navigators, they can hire community outreach professionals, liaisons that are out working with potential landowners or apartment owners to rent their units. Now, the challenge there, of course, is the budgeting. HUD only
Mm-hmm.
allows so much to do this, and a lot of the agencies don't have the money to hire those folks. But what the study ended up talking about, which has been done in many areas, is these agencies can partner with local nonprofits or local community government, organizations, community organizations to provide those kind of services because they're all interested in seeing people kept off the streets as well. So it's usually within their mission, these other nonprofits to kind of bring those kind of services forward as a venture with the housing agencies. So that's another area that we talk about in the study. Another option is, of course, to take your housing choice voucher and make it a project-based voucher. So you assign the voucher to a specific property. We don't know that that's more of a last resort because it kind of goes away from the design of the program, which is to give people the option to go where they want to live. That's the so-called choice. And when you assign a voucher to a project, now the person's required to live in that specific property. The good news there, though, is that the voucher can now be used. Usually, if you assign a certain allotment, it can now be used to help finance a redevelopment with the tax credit program and other things. So that's another area that we feel is an option to pursue.
I think that's very helpful. Another area that I've heard a lot about is the quality standards and inspections. You're building new properties. You're also doing preservation. How does that factor in?
As far as like the tax credit program, is that you're referring to there?
The housing quality standards.
Yeah, so you have to have an inspection of the unit by the agency, and the agency's got to go through and look at it, and then they either give you a thumbs up or thumbs down. That's all part of the process, which makes sense. There are recommendations now to allow for a unit if it's already financed with tax credits or home or another agency which is already doing an inspection, that should suffice for HUD and the agency to waive the requirement for a quality inspection. So that's on the table right now, but I think that would require a legislative change.
Yeah.
That's what we're seeing. That is in the bill that's on in front of Congress now. That's one of the changes that is being recommended. And there are other things that would take legislation that we're, as an industry, supporting, including having the ability to do a pre-inspection so that if a landlord wanted to rent their unit, they don't have to wait to have a voucher holder show up. They can actually get inspection well before that, so it's ready to go.
Yeah.
There's several other areas there, but our focus for the study was to try to get more towards what can be done now.
That's great. And we've talked about this. I've talked to Ben Metcalf at Terner about it. We actually have a 2-hour meeting this afternoon with our AI consultant. And the importance, and I've talked to Secretary Terner, is actually going from the study to the regulation is often the hardest part. And we have a lot of studies over the last 20 years. We've never really been able to turn that into policy solutions that are executable and executed. And so we're working to use AI to incorporate all of this feedback, starting with your report, and then the existing regulation in the statute, and say, to address these issues, what would a notice of proposed rulemaking look like, and draft that. And then once it does that, and we talk a lot about AI and the mistakes that it can make, and I think about it like a new employee. I would never hire somebody and just say, here's your cubicle, here's a pile of papers, nice to meet you. We'll talk to you at your review. So it's a very interactive process. It's like training a new employee. It's just this particular employee happens to have an IQ of 4,000 and types 200 words a minute. So that's something we're not used to. But we are hopeful that we're going to come up with a draft reg that we can work with you and National Multifamily Housing Council and others, as well as tenant groups, to say, does this make sense? Does this work? And come up with, in the back and forth, a ready for publication notice of proposed rulemaking. And I can sit down with Secretary Terner and say, here you go. This has broad support. We've just saved you 2 years worth of work. Let's talk about how we get this into the Federal Register. And I'm hoping we're going to actually be able to turn this incredible work that you've done into an incredible regulation.
I would say on that point that if we could get the rulemaking to allow for the streamlining of inspections we talked about, where you have an automatic approval if a property is already being inspected by a light tech regulation or a home or RD, that would be probably the number one thing we will benefit from. And I to be honest, I'm not sure it would require legislation. I think that may very well be within the ability of the secretary to promulgate, so I would say that would be very helpful. And then this, other things like the advanced inspections, these are pretty simple things that I would imagine that they could provide for as well. And then, somehow creating more flexibility for housing authorities to use their budgets for things like, security deposit assistance, hiring dedicated staff, liaisons with landlords, these kind of things, which happen to be they're already being done and, of course, move to work, right? This is not an experiment. It's something that's being done now with certain categories of the agencies.
Let's pivot here to some of the challenges that go outside of the regulations. We have a real problem in this country with immigration, people coming over the border in pretty significant numbers over the last several years. And some of the folks who have the biggest problem with that are people who actually are immigrants who waited and went through the process and are here legally. But the response has been pretty severe. And one of the sectors of the economy that's really had to deal with this has been in the workforce of home building, both single family and multifamily. You're at pretty much ground zero on this in California. What are you seeing? How is it going? And what are some of the things that we need to be thinking about as this policy continues to evolve?
Great question, great topic. As hard as it is, not only do we not have enough homes for people to live in, we just don't have enough people to build the homes. And that's been a growing problem now for a decade or more. I think the more recent data shows that the construction industry is predicted to require an additional 1 million new workers over the next 2 years just to keep up with demand. In the meantime, we're deporting or threatening to deport a large portion of our workforce in the residential housing industry. It's a contentious issue. I was at a meeting last week with a member of Congress who happens to be very much a hardliner when it comes to, immigration. And I brought up a bill that's now being brought to Congress and seems to be getting a lot of bipartisan support called the Dignity Act. And the Dignity Act basically is it's not seeking amnesty for illegal immigrants. It's simply providing a path for legal work permits for folks that have demonstrated that they're good players, they're good participants in the workforce. And it gets a 7-year process. You have to be without any criminal activity. There's a very stringent requirement to get to the point after 7 years where you're now permitted to become authorized work permit and worker here, having been not authorized before. So we feel this is important in the industry and we're pushing for this. And we think it's really important for the construction residential industry because of the shortage we're seeing. But, when I brought that up to this member of Congress, it quickly turned into sort of like a meltdown. And members started going off on historical amnesty programs that failed, and agriculture has tried this and that and it hasn't worked. And In the meantime, we're talking about housing. So it quickly didn't go anywhere. But I do think, despite the fact that there are hardliners in the Congress that will not agree to this and never will agree to it, there is a growing sense of need within the majority, which I think will ultimately get us to where we need to be, which is we've got to do something about the workforce that is here. Because I think it's like 30% of the residential workforce is immigrant workers, and most of those are undocumented.
Yeah.
So we've got to be able to figure that out. I mean, the reality is, if I'm not mistaken, like I said, the million new workers needed over the next 2 years. Texas alone, being a good red state, is going to require 250,000 construction workers over the next 2 years. So this isn't just a blue state issue, right? This goes through the heart of the country. The other challenge we have is like we have an aging workforce now. So a lot of the skilled trades that are out there working on these jobs, the electricians, the plumbers, the framers, all these folks, the average age is 42 years. We've got a few years left before these folks are going to move on to something else, and we don't have the pipeline coming in behind them. So that gets to a whole nother issue of workforce training, which
Yeah.
we're also pushing for now.
And that's where you supported an act called the Constructs Act. How does that work?
Yeah, so the Constructs Act is a bill that's also introduced now in Congress. It's getting, again, more good bipartisan support. What that does is it funds training for the types of jobs we're talking about here, electricians, plumbers, framers, et cetera, that would go to work in the residential industry for construction jobs and would train them at the community college level and actually recruit younger kids, even at the high school level, to come into the trades, which is needed. We have to get out there and recruit because it's not what most folks choose to do. Most folks think the only avenue is to go to college and have all this, college debt build up and have to fight for a white collar job. There are other options. And I think this Constructs Act will help with that. So we're seeing, again, more interest there. We think that's another avenue for us to be able to address this need. It's going to take both. We've got to train the folks that are here legally that we want to bring into the industry. And we've got to give folks that are here that are working undocumented a path to become authorized work permits.
So another area that has been a big controversy, we might as well just touch all the third rails here, is trade. The Supreme Court is, as we speak, considering case on trade. And certainly in your space, a lot of components of these houses, of these units, come from other countries: gypsum, electrical panels, obviously lumber, steel. How are you experiencing this past 10 months in the trade space? How is it impacting costs, and what do you think we need to do?
It's a big challenge with or without tariffs. We're seeing costs go up, significantly over the last several years in many areas that affect our industry. Lumber, like you say, steel, appliances, all of the things that go into building a home, costs have continued to go up in addition to the labor costs, which was what we just talked about. But now that we're having to face these tariffs, it's made the problem more acute and concerning. We haven't seen a huge jump just yet in costs as a result of the tariffs because they've really just been recently been rolled out to become effective. And lumber is an interesting one because we've had a tariff on Canadian lumber for quite a while, and a good amount of the lumber that we receive to build our properties across the country comes from Canadian lumber, and there's been a tariff there for quite a while.
Yeah, I've been talking about it here for 5 years. We've been talking about it, and this is not new.
There's been different ways to approach this. I know Congress passed a bill earlier this year, called Fix Our Forest Act, which opens up the forest to producing lumber needed to build the homes here. But that takes years for it to ever become effective. So I would say that might be a fix for the long term, but it also faces a lot of resistance, as you can imagine, from the environmentalists. But the reality is our forests sometimes in many cases are overgrown, and cutting trees out and thinning the forest is a good thing. It keeps them healthier, and this could also help the home building industry as well. So we can't just rely on foreign imports when it comes to lumber. We got to be able to tap our own sources.
Yeah, it's definitely an and, not an or in my book.
Yeah.
So this has been great. I could talk about this with you all day long. And it's one of the things I love about talking with home builders and property owners and developers is you have mud on your boots, literally. And I learned so much. And it's just irresponsible to be involved in policy and not have that informed by the people who are actually doing it. I deeply appreciate what you do. And I really appreciate you schooling me and helping me make sure that I'm thinking about all the different factors that go into this. It's incredibly helpful.
Well, I want to thank you for what you're doing with this podcast and everything you're doing with the National Housing Conference. I mean, public awareness, I think, is going to be the most important thing for our industry to address in order to solve the problem. Unless the public understands the crisis that we're facing, we're never going to have a solution. In fact, I always talk about the fact that most people are aware of the housing crisis because of the homelessness that exists, right? You know, we're now at an all-time high. 750,000 people live on the streets or in shelters around the country, California leading the way, of course. But that's really just the tip of the iceberg. And there's 10 million people who are living paycheck to paycheck, paying 50, 60, 80% of their income in rent just to survive, one paycheck away from being on the street. And I think that people don't really know that. I mean, you and I know that because we're in the industry, but the reality is this is what's below the surface, that part of the iceberg that people don't see.
So my favorite question when I have guests on the show is asking, what is the most interesting and important thing about you that has nothing to do with your work?
I would have to say, David, that would be my passion for running. I've been a runner for 30 years. I started running after college just for my own mental health and realized it is something I really enjoyed and started running marathons and back in the day and then eventually graduated to running ultra marathons and
Wow.
since then I've run some 35 ultra marathons and probably 20
so
marathons.
People need to know because I'm blown away by that. How many miles is an ultra marathon?
Yeah, so an ultra marathon is anything longer than a marathon. So that would include basically a 50K, which is 31 miles, a 50 mile, and a 100 mile. So those are like the three big categories that people gravitate to.
And what's your longest marathon?
Well, the longest ultra I've done is 100 milers. I've done a few of those.
Basically 4 marathons in a row.
It's called survival.
Yeah, no kidding. So I have run 2 marathons. I did the Marine Corps Marathon in 2001. It was a great experience. It also nearly killed me. We're about the same age, and I have to say that I got a lot more hardware in my knees than apparently you do. The last thing my surgeon said to me was, there's a lot of things you can do. Running ain't one of them. If you really want to see me again, put your running shoes back on. So I am very jealous, but also impressed, and good for you. It is a real high. Not all of it, but definitely there are moments where it's like, wow, I'm just in that zone, and I do miss it. One of my favorite moments is when I'm crossing a street and I'm playing with the light and I get to have an excuse to run across the street, and I always think to myself, yeah, I do really miss this. But I also don't walk with a cane and am able to ski and bike again, so I'm not complaining.
I'm able to stay healthy mainly because I try not to run on concrete. I mostly run on trails, and that keeps my knees and everything else a little bit more stable and it's less impactful. But running, it's just one of those things. It's hard to replace because I can go anywhere and put my shoes on and go out for a run. And as opposed to cycling or swimming or tennis or golf, I mean, you got to have all these other things. You can't do it, as much travel as we do in our industry. You got to have that flexibility, which has been great.
Pretty much anywhere at any time.
Yeah.
So
as long as you're in the right mood. You got to be in the right mood, though, which is part of the challenge.
Yeah, I think for me, the right mood was don't think about your mood, just put your damn shoes on.
Yep, the just do it mindset.
Yeah, there you go. Thank you, Nike. A little plug there. We don't advertise yet, but we may have to think about it. We'll post-sell this podcast. Thank you, Will. Really appreciate you joining us.
Thank you so much, David. And again, thank you for all you do and what NHC does. And we're happy to be part of that program and appreciate you inviting me.
Thank you for listening to this edition of Beyond Four Walls. You can visit the National Housing Conference at nhc.org. There you can learn more about affordable housing policies, affordability challenges throughout the nation on our Paycheck to Paycheck database, and explore membership in NHC for you or your organization. We appreciate your interest and look forward to working with you in the future. Until next time, I'm David Dworkin, NHC's President and CEO, wishing you a great day.